This is a story I heard just coming up to 30 years ago when I was a producer on the World in Action programme on ITV, and we were covering the Falklands War, and in particular the aftermath, where there was a huge controversy about the circumstances surrounding the sinking of the Argentine cruiser Belgrano, killing 323 men, sunk by the British nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror. And it was generally agreed that it had been the sinking of the Belgrano that had made inevitable an all-out shooting war in the South Atlantic, although obviously many people argue that actually the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands had made that inevitable. Anyway, the real fighting, shooting war started from that moment, and the rest of that was history. But the controversy arose because the government account of the sinking had turned out to be inaccurate in a number of different respects. And in the weeks and months following the war, a number of Labour MPs, in particular Tam Dalyell, had been asking the government a series of questions about the circumstances of the sinking. And one after another, it seemed as though the government was being wrong-footed. The government's account was inaccurate. And it transpired that, of course, the government had been so concerned to justify the action under the terms of self-defence, because war had not properly been declared, that they described the circumstances of the sinking in terms that made the Belgrano seem much more of an immediate threat to the British task force than probably it was at the moment of sinking. The Navy always argued straightforwardly, well, the Belgrano was an enemy ship, she was at sea, we sank her before she attacked and sank us. And probably if the government had said that, there might have been a fuss for a few days, but then it would have been forgotten. But the government embellished the story. Anyway, as I say, in those weeks and months following the war, Tam Dalyell in particular and others asked a series of questions of the government in which the government account of the sinking unravelled. And it transpired that Tam Dalyell was using as one of his sources a diary which had been written by an officer on board HMS Conqueror, the supply officer, which gave a day-by-day, hour-by-hour account of what was going on, and that account was different from the official account, so the government was being wrong-footed. So at that time, we're talking about November 1984, lots of journalists were trying to find the author of this diary. And I was very fortunate, somebody gave me the name, and it was a man called Narendra Sethia, who had left the Navy after the war and gone to live and work in the West Indies. So I went to the West Indies and found him, brought him back and made a World in Action programme that was very dramatic, his version of events. But just as that was happening, the then Defence Secretary, Michael Heseltine, amazed everybody by announcing that a logbook from on board HMS Conqueror had gone missing, a logbook covering the relevant time. And Narendra Sethi was accused of having stolen it. He subsequently sued the newspapers that had accused him of having stolen it and won his case. But everybody assumed, if it hadn't been stolen by Sethia or somebody on the submarine, that actually it had gone missing or had been sort of tucked away by the government because it contained information that was further embarrassing to the government's account of the sinking of the Belgrano. It contained something that would sort of wrong-foot their story. When I was looking for this, I was talking to a number of submariners from the Conqueror, and one of them said to me, if you really want to know what happened to the logbook, you should ask yourself why it is that the logbooks, because they were 1 month at a time, covering the period of the sinking of the Belgrano had gone missing, but so have the 3 months following the return to the UK of the submarine. Maybe they went missing because of something that happened during that period. So this was a fascinating thought, because obviously it was usually involved in lots of Cold War activities against the Soviet Union. So I started making inquiries about what the Conqueror had done when it immediately came back after the war, and I was told this extraordinary story in which the Conqueror had been involved, and what that basically was this, that In the 70s, the United Kingdom and the United States submarines had developed a piece of kit called a towed array sonar. And what that is a long piece of cable that's towed behind the submarine or trawler, and along it there's a whole series of sonars which enable them to do a sort of triangulated beam in which will enable them to detect enemy vessels on a sort of two-dimensional sort of plane, and also because the listening devices were a long way from the towing ship or submarine, the noise from the ship or submarine didn't interfere with the listening. So this was a piece of technology that the UK and the US had, but then all of a sudden it emerged that the Soviets were using the same piece of kit. And so the question arose, had the Soviets managed to develop this piece of kit independently, or did they have a spy in UK or US intelligence or research that had given them the secret? So the United States said that what we really need is to get hold of a version of the towed array being used by a Soviet vessel to bring it back, to analyse it, to find out the answer to this question. Well, Conqueror had been the submarine that was chosen for this task, and this started before the Falklands War. And the submarine was basically fitted with these two pincers that were in the bow of the boat, that sort of like lobster claws, and it was all very sort of sophisticated device. But the idea was that it was going to sneak up behind a trawler or submarine using a towed array, and basically snip the cable and bring the towed array back. But the important thing is that it was going to cut the cable in a way that would make it not clear to the towing vessel. It was going to gnaw it away, so it wouldn't be obvious that the cable had been cut. It might have broken because the towed array got snagged on a rock or something of this kind. Anyway, the Conqueror had a couple of attempts at this before the Falklands War that were unsuccessful, or perhaps they were exercises. But immediately after the Conqueror returned to Faslane at the end of the Falklands War, intelligence was received that a towed array sonar was being used by a Polish trawler up in the North Atlantic. And so Conqueror was tasked to go straight off and see if it could obtain this piece of kit. Well, it did. Absolutely amazingly, they carried out this extraordinarily sophisticated exercise, which was very delicate, sensitive, very, very dangerous, obtained this towed array, stowed it on board the submarine, brought it back, sent it over to the Atlantic. Leaving the Russians, or the Soviets, not knowing whether their towed array had just got snagged on a rock or whether it had been stolen. So now you've got a situation where the government or the House of Commons is calling for documents from on board the submarine, and among the documents they're probably going to call for are these logbooks, and if you see the logbook you're going to be able to tell that this British nuclear submarine is up in this area of the North Atlantic where this incident has taken place at exactly the time when the incident has taken place. So if the Russians had seen that and been in any doubt about whether their towed array had been stolen or they had just lost it, that would have given them the answer. So therefore it was really important that this logbook disappeared and that there was no record of this operation. So that's why the logbook from on board the Conqueror went missing. Now obviously I couldn't tell the story then because this was a genuine sort of military secret, classified sort of top secret. So basically I waited 28 years until a couple of years ago. Contacted the Ministry of Defence and said I'd like to tell this story. I've known it for more than a quarter of a century, and could they declassify it? They thought about it for about 9 months, and in the end said no, they couldn't. They weren't going to declassify it. Anyway, we had a lot of discussion, at the end of which they said, well, they weren't going to give me any help, and they weren't going to authorise anybody to break the Official Secrets Act. But if I was going to write the story, they wouldn't seek to stop me from publishing it. So that's in fact what's happened. And so I wrote the book, and it's called The Secrets of the Conqueror. This is it. And it tells the sort of amazing story of bravery and on board the submarine. And I think the moral of the story for understanding of history is that the kind of conspiracy theory that received wisdom among anybody who studied the Falklands War was that this logbook had gone missing because it contained information about the sinking of the Belgrano. Actually, sometimes with these things you have to think outside the box. What could be a completely different explanation, and in fact the explanation is nothing at all to do with the Falklands War, nothing to do with the sinking of the Belgrano, but actually to do with what the HMS Conqueror was involved in the whole of the rest of the time, which was the Cold War. It's an exciting story and very intrepid, and everybody on board was very courageous and very skilled, and so I'm glad to have been able to tell it so that actually some of them who don't mind getting the recognition can get the recognition that they undoubtedly deserve.